Good afternoon. Welcome to this edition of our Between Two Bookshelves series, which offers brief dives into humanities advocacy and policy. Thank you for joining us. My name is Cecily Hill, and I am the Director of Community Initiatives at the National Humanities Alliance. I am joined by Vivé Griffith, Director of Outreach and Engagement at the Clemente Course, and Katie Ringsmuth, Director of the NN Cannery History Project. In addition to our members from colleges, universities, and scholarly societies, we are joined today by a number of congressional staffers who are interested in learning more about how humanities programs are continuing to have an impact on their communities throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. The work being undertaken by the Clemente Course and the NN Cannery History Project is emblematic of humanities work being undertaken by individuals and organizations throughout the United States. Humanities organizations are always integral to their communities. They provide professional development and continuing education for K-12 teachers. They hold and protect our history and ensure broad access to that history through publication and digitization projects. And they provide opportunities for connection and dialogue across differences. This work can have profound impacts, as we at NHA have seen while partnering with humanities organizations to survey their program participants over the past several years. For example, a survey of NEH-funded reading and discussion programs for veterans demonstrated that these programs helped veterans overcome social isolation and build support networks. 93% of participants across 4 programs indicated that the humanities materials they reflected upon helped them understand their experiences. 100% reported a desire to keep in touch with some of the people they met through the program. And 79% across 5 programs agreed that the program made them more likely to ask for help if they need it. Surveys of a community archiving program based in New York City demonstrated that the program increased participants' sense of pride and feelings of belonging. 95% of participants agreed that the program helped them make connections between their experiences and those of previous generations, and 100% agreed that they felt a greater sense of belonging as a result of having a project focused on preserving their cultural heritage. For those of you listening in who are interested in implementing surveys like these in your work, NHA has developed an impact survey toolkit, which is available on our website. We have recently added a humanities impact survey for programs that deal directly with the COVID-19 pandemic so that we can better understand how and why these programs matter to our communities. As the Clemente Course and the NN Cannery Project both make clear, humanities work is ongoing and necessary in this time of social distancing. Now, I'm going to turn to both of our guests one at a time, briefly asking them a few questions before opening up the conversation to questions from our audience. So I'm going to start with you, Vivé. Please tell us about the Clemente Course in the Humanities. How does the program work?
Sure. First of all, thanks so much, Cecily, for inviting us to be part of this conversation. We're really glad to be here. The Clemente Course in the Humanities is a coalition of programs across the country offering free college humanities classes to adults who are living on low incomes and have faced barriers to education. We were founded in the mid-1990s in New York City, and there are now more than 30 Clemente courses in communities across the country. At the heart of what we do is bringing the sort of intensive college humanities seminar into community spaces. Our classes are taught by university faculty. They are interdisciplinary. Students study literature, philosophy, US history, art history, and critical thinking and writing in a 2-semester sort of deep dive course. We really prize engagement with texts and ideas and conversation. But what we aim to do is match this sort of rigorous intellectual experience with a lot of support services. So our courses are always free for participants. We cover books and tuition. In non-COVID times, we provide childcare for students to come to class and sort of make sure that their families are taken care of, transportation assistance when it's needed. Some programs begin their evening with meals for students. Some have social workers or case managers. So our goal is to remove the obstacles that keep people from the classroom, to really invite people to the table for really rich and important conversations, and to provide a bridge to higher education. Our courses are accredited. Students can earn credit, most of them from Bard College in New York, which is a longtime academic partner, but some courses have local partnerships like University of Wisconsin, Austin Community College, but in all of the courses, there's the opportunity to complete this experience, earn college credit for it, and use it as a bridge to higher education afterwards.
Great. Can you tell us more about the communities that are served by the Clemente course?
Sure. At this point, Clemente is working in communities across the country in urban places like New York and Chicago and LA, in rural and small communities like Holyoke, Massachusetts, and Port Townsend, Washington. Our typical student in our sort of typical Clemente course is an adult living at or below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, who doesn't have a college degree and has generally been shut out of education by any number of things. Their financial situation, situations like homelessness, domestic violence, incarceration, sort of being in a place where there's lack of support for their larger goals and aspirations. Looking across the country, the median age of a Clemente student is 39. We serve many more women than men. About 73% of our students are women. Most are people of color. Most have children in the home. In our last national study, about a third of our students were living below with an income of less than $10,000 a year. So we're really serving those that we don't always see in a college classroom. But they're smart and they're curious and they have experience and education and voices to bring to the table. We also have an initiative that started in 2015 that is serving veterans. And this started after Leila Hilton, our executive director, got a phone call from a Gold Star mother who had read a book about Clemente written by our founder, Earl Shores, and she had lost her son after his military service to suicide. And she said, I feel like if my son had taken a Clemente course, he would still be here today. And in talking to our directors across the country, we heard that a lot of veterans came to our courses and got a lot out of the courses. So we launched a veterans initiative, and this takes the Clemente model, but weaves in texts and ideas that are really central to those who have had military experiences. So questions of war and civic duty and family and honor and sacrifice, texts from the Iliad to the poems of Brian Turner, who's an Iraq veteran now. So that's been really successful and is expanding. It's in 5 communities right now, and it's helped us see how we can serve both sort of broadly these underserved communities and very specific communities as well.
And I know that some of those veterans courses are funded by the NEH as well.
They are, yes.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of impacts have you seen as a result of these programs, both the veterans programs and the ones not for veterans?
Yeah. We've done a lot of looking at the impacts of the programs, and we just completed a retrospective study of the programs in Chicago. There are 4 courses running in Chicago, and they're celebrating their 20th anniversary. So we did a retrospective study looking at the impacts on participants over 20 years. And they take a lot of forms. So there are really strong academic impacts, improvements in critical thinking skills, writing skills, and they tell us that those are applicable not just in academic settings, but in professional and other settings. We had a student that said, my boss called me in to say that my emails were the strongest ones of anyone in her department. This sort of sense that we can take those skills into all of these settings. In Illinois, with that study, we found out that 73% of our students had taken additional college courses and about half had earned a degree since they finished the program. So really strong bridge to higher education. We look at sort of psychosocial and personal outcomes. We see increased confidence in achieving goals, in succeeding in higher education, in speaking in front of people. We look at a lot of those kinds of skills. And we were interested to see significant improvement in people's life satisfaction. So areas like their living situation, their financial situation, their career and employment situation. And then we always say that sort of the brass ring for Clemente is civic engagement. The program was founded with this idea that by giving people this experience, we gave them a sense of their voice and agency and the ability to go advocate in their larger communities. And so with this Chicago study, we were able to compare our students with a civic engagement study that was done in 2010 with the general population in Chicago. And our students are much more likely to volunteer in their communities, to be registered to vote. So we know that there are strong civic engagement outcomes. I do want to say that NHA has been really helpful in measuring the outcomes of our veterans programming and helped us do an evaluation of those programs. And we see that our veterans say that they read more widely after taking the course. They think of themselves as lifelong learners. They have more confidence to pursue their goals. But 91% said that they're more confident taking part in thoughtful discussions. They've changed their habits of thinking, and a similar number said they'd improve their ability to think critically and reflect on literature. So it's been really good to see those kinds of outcomes being measured as well.
And how has COVID-19 changed things for the Clemente course?
Well, I think like any educational program or institution, it's sort of turned everything on its head in a real immediate sense. Clemente is really based on this intimate and personal experience of sort of coming around a table with books in front of us and being in conversation together. And it was, we had not done our work virtually and had not really even talked about doing our work virtually. It wasn't something that was in discussion at all. We found most of our programs were able to continue virtually. There were some programs that chose not to continue or to delay continuing, sort of in conversation with their students. But it posed a lot of challenges. First of all, it became really clear to us that access to education is predicated on access to technology. And our students who are very often, who are low income and living with limited resources, very often did not have computers in their homes, often did not have Wi-Fi and connectivity in their homes. And that stands directly in the way of their being able to continue participating in the course. So we had to do a lot of work to raise money to buy technology, to do safe handouts of loaned computers and things like that to just get students online and able to participate. A lot of our students have children at home, which was a huge challenge. It's one thing when they can come to school and put them in a childcare program, and it's another thing when they have a 3-year-old and they're trying to be in a class talking about Plato's Republic in the evening. And a lot of them are essential workers. So we had a lot of stories of people logging into Zoom on the subway home from their job at a bank, or, coming home from a hospital where they worked and sort of gathering themselves and coming back in. So it had a strong impact on our students, but at the same time, it was pretty amazing to see what could happen in those spaces. I think our faculty adapted really quickly. We came together across our network to sort of brainstorm how to do our work really well. And we were able to keep students in class. In Seattle, they opened their doors to students from across the country. So our veterans program in Seattle then had veterans from Boston and California and Hawaii in class with local students. So there was a lot of innovation going on. But we know that was facilitated by having the classes already underway. We're really curious about how we boot up for the new year and how we create safe communities and welcoming communities in a virtual environment with our students. So.
And I think my last question for you right now is, how are your participants responding to the changes in the program? And if you could talk a little bit more about the value they see in continuing to participate in the program.
Yeah. I think it was really heartening. Part of my role in Clemente is sort of gathering the stories from around the country, and it's really heartening to look at the ways that students did continue to engage in the kinds of things that we did. And at one of our graduations went virtual. One of our graduations, the director talked about how, we were suited to do this in that coming together around text. She sort of talked about texts are always bridging distance and time. Texts are always this way in which we create connections with each other and with different ideas. And I think what we heard from students is being able to come into community in this time of crisis was really important to them. Being able to think about things other than COVID-19 and the immediate, moment was really useful to them. And then being able to do some reflecting. I think like all humanities organizations, we're thinking a lot about how the humanities allow us to reflect and make meaning in times of crisis. That's what they've always been doing. And so we saw that happening in some really cool ways. I'll give you like a few examples. Our course in Chicago had a history unit that looked at memorials and monuments and how those sort of reflect history. And the director there said that when they got to the end of that unit and they were looking at the 9/11 memorial, students found themselves talking about like what kind of memorial will be made to this moment, to the people that we lose from COVID, to the people that are on the front lines during COVID, which I found very, very, very moving. At the same time, we had a program that was reading Waiting for Godot, and the students sort of saw themselves reflected in these characters sort of in this suspended state as they were, that reflected sort of the moment that they felt like they were in. But the director there said that a student said like, well, the thing about this is at least they have each other, and it became sort of a theme for their course continuing on, that like they're in this state of suspension and waiting, and yet they get to come together and do that. We had a course that did a a Saturday Zoom session of reading Walt Whitman's Song of Myself aloud, and we had 20 people come together and across Zoom sort of hear that poem aloud and then talk about it as a poem of embrace of people and diversity in the moment. So I think that for a lot of students, this became a safe haven in a time that was really difficult, and that what the text does in a normal moment in Clemente was even heightened in these moments, that the way that they help us to think about our lives and think about how we move forward sort of bravely and courageously when things are not as we expected them to be. So.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm going to turn to you now, Katie, and I'd love it if you could tell us about the NN Diamond Cannery and about your work to document its history. What are your goals for the project?
Well, first of all, good morning. It's still morning here in Alaska, so thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. So the NN Cannery History Project is a grassroots public history endeavor that, through the historical lens of work, aims to share the oft-forgotten stories of the multitudes of people who canned salmon in Alaska and created an ethnically diverse, economically vital cannery culture. And my team essentially consists of all volunteers. We're a volunteer staff of historians, policy wonks, artists, curators, and filmmakers. But we have significant partners, and they include the Alaska State Museum, the National Park Service, the Bristol Bay Borough, and Trident Seafoods, which is the largest seafood company in the United States. The Diamond NN Cannery is located on the south bank of the Naknek River, and the Naknek River is one of 5 major river systems that make up the Bristol Bay red salmon commercial fishery. This is the largest salmon fishery in the entire world. The cannery itself is not the oldest in Alaska, but it very likely processed more salmon than any. It started as a saltery. It was built in 1890. It was converted into a cannery by the Alaska Packers Association in 1895. And it canned salmon with the exception of 2 years during World War II until the end of the century in 2000. The cannery didn't burn, which is unusual, and the core buildings never changed purpose. Therefore, this is a property along with its 52 interrelated buildings that tell a story that spans the entire 20th century. And those buildings offer information about the diverse workforce that in many ways has been left out of the nation's historic narrative. And our goal for this project is very simple: to document and share the underrepresented history of Alaska's forgotten cannery workforce. This is a historically invisible workforce made up of Asians, Latinos, Alaska Native laborers, who, despite being historically forgotten, were nevertheless essential participants in one of the West Coast's most significant 20th century industries. This is an industry that represented the Industrial Revolution of the North. And to accomplish this goal, we are working with, for example, the National Park Service, the State Historic Preservation Office, to nominate the NN Cannery as a Maritime Historic District to the National Register of Historic Places. We've developed a digital storytelling workshop to give the young people of Bristol Bay a voice and really the confidence to be able to share their history. We've created a digital oral history archive with the University of Alaska based on cannery workers' social histories, which can now be accessed by researchers anywhere in the world. And we are currently in the process of producing a museum exhibition with the Alaska State Museum in Juneau. It's called Mug Up, the Language of Work, and it will share the stories of Alaska's essential cannery people through the workscape. And I should point out that this is a very collaborative project, and we could not achieve what we have without the partnerships and the collaborators that we are working with. And we have relied on the expertise of cultural resource practitioners, filmmakers, archivists, artists, oral historians, curators, but mostly I want to say that we rely very much on the support of the community itself.
And can you tell us about the people, what the project means for that community, for the people who live in Bristol Bay and for those people who used to work in the cannery?
Sure. So the National Endowment for the Humanities awarded the NN Cannery History Project a Creating Humanities Community Grant to revive, reunite, and to raise awareness of the multicultural community that has existed in canneries, not just at the NN, but throughout the Pacific Slope for over a century. But rather than attempting to thinly cover all Alaska canneries, and there are hundreds of them, we concentrated on one, this 130-year-old diamond NN cannery at South Naknek, thereby utilizing one site to tell this vast and deep social history of cannery people and how occupational life changed over time. Now, the cannery was shut down permanently in 2015 by the current owners, Trident Seafoods. But despite being in a state of decline, the NN Cannery is still a place that holds extraordinary community values and history, and therefore creates a conduit for expressing the voices of the cannery people, both the local and the global perspectives. You know, we're going to have to raise a lot more money if we want to actually save these buildings. You know, when they're no longer useful working, they're going to disappear into the tundra. But what we can do with this project is assign dignity to the people who worked within those buildings, from the Filipino carpenters, the Chinese butchers, to the native spring fall crew. Cannery people's collective knowledge of the mechanical operation, the physical labor, the salmon themselves formed the cannery's industrial backbone. This was an industry that helped change the way the world ate. The parent company was Del Monte. And still, these are people who existed in the shadows, only to be marginalized, exotified, or ignored. So our goal is to spotlight cannery people and bring them from the shadows of history, and to show how Bristol Bay connected Alaska to the rest of the world. And now Bristol Bay youth can be equally proud of a mother who cleans fish as a father who catches them. And in many ways, our project is designed to validate that work that has deep ties to the region's cultural and ecological history. And work is a universal concept that transcends the historically unfamiliar. It connects this little known cannery experience to knowledge and values shared from visitors who come to Alaska, who might be from California, Texas, or Kansas. Visitors may not know anything about salmon canneries, but they're probably aware of their essential grocery store workers, their meat packers, their farm laborers back home. So hopefully what the cannery experience can do is bring dignity to those essential workers too.
Wonderful. And I understand, and one of the reasons you're here today to talk is because part of this project commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Spanish flu last year, which I know for Alaska really happened in 1919 and 1918. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what that involved.
Yes, so the NN Cannery's historic value goes far beyond just putting fish into a can. In the spring of 1919, 101 years ago, when cannery ships arrived to Bristol Bay, cannery doctors found people in the villages sick and dying, stricken with Spanish influenza. The Bristol Bay outbreak in 1919 was the final manifestation of that pandemic. And in fact, more people died in greater percentages here in Alaska than any people in the Americas. The flu buried most of Bristol Bay's adult population, claiming hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. The flu left behind an entire generation of children, many of them infants. Now we know what happened because the heartbreaking history was preserved in reports requested by the Alaska Packers president, Henry Fortman, whose crews returned to when the crews returned back to San Francisco. And we've also uncovered photographs that reveal the story of what happened to the children. So the intent in 2019 was to commemorate this 100-year-old story that many people just didn't even know about, not even Alaskans. And our aim was to remember, you know, those who died tragically, those who became the unlikely healthcare heroes, and those who survived this tragedy to give birth to Bristol Bay's current generation. And in addition to attaching the story of the flu to the National Register nomination and working to tell the narrative through the exhibit, last summer, we produced a a photo exhibition called Bristol Bay Remembers the Great Flu of 1919. It was displayed at the Bristol Bay Historical Society Museum in Naknek, Alaska, and then it moved to Anchorage, where it was displayed at the Alaska Humanities Forum and is currently now at the Bristol Bay Native Corporation headquarters, also in Anchorage. Tim Troll, who is the director of the Bristol Bay Heritage Land Trust and curator of the exhibit, he also published a book that included firsthand accounts and photographs of the flu pandemic. And then in October of last year, I wanted to produce a short film that could commemorate this story via social media. So those were some of the things that we did, without even knowing what was going to happen next.
And I understand that the work that you did in commemorating the Spanish flu has had a lasting impact now. I'm wondering if you could talk about that impact, what kind of impact that work is now having more broadly.
Well, what intended to mark a seemingly forgotten historic event definitely took on new meaning when the recent coronavirus outbreak hit in early 2020. Suddenly, our stories moved from the realm of history to help inform local communities about the present situation. Since then, we have shared lessons learned from 1919 with university students, local journalists, even national and international press seeking historic contextualization. Media outlets, I've done interviews with, Time Magazine, National Fisherman, the public television station KTUOO here in Alaska, also our national affiliate stations like KTUU. They requested, everybody wanted to compare what happened in 1919 to find some sense of understanding of what was happening now. In fact, the local CBS affiliate station KTVA produced a 30-minute show on their series Frontiers called A Year of Death and Survival, which just added to the exposure of this story. In fact, even the Korean broadcasting system reached out to us for film footage as well as analysis from a global perspective. Likewise, local governments in Bristol Bay, when trying to figure out strategies on how to deal with the current fishing season, which is taking place right now, they cited the 1919 crisis to help inform their reasoning. So, this is a story that just the summer before we helped bring to the public, we helped bring to their attention. Ultimately, that did help inform the decision making, but it also helped inform the residents and the fishing community to support those decisions. So it's, what began as a commemorative history effort ended up really helping the current Alaskan population to better understand the significance of human resilience and courage. And these are characteristics that underpin Alaska's extraordinary people, both then and now.
Wonderful. And we're about to turn to the audience for Q&A. So if those of you who are listening in, if you want to submit a question, you can just click on the Q&A button and then submit your question that way. While we wait for questions to come in, I'm going to ask Katie and Vivé one final question, one for both of them, which is, we conceived of this program in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we are also well aware that it's not the only crisis facing our country. And I know that both of your projects and your organizations are deeply interested in our country's diverse history. So I'm wondering if you could reflect upon how both of those projects speak to Black Lives Matter and to anti-racist work more broadly. I think we'll start with Vivé and then to Katie. Vivé, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, it's absolutely a critical moment, and this particular moment of protests and demands for justice came right as our courses were wrapping up. It would have been interesting to see how they were woven into this year's sort of curriculum and conversation. But at the risk of sounding trite, I think that Black Lives Matter has always been important for Clemente. Black voices, Black ideas, Black perspectives has always been prioritized at our table. It's sort of baked into why we exist. Our model of access is about looking at who's been shut out of these spaces, who's not had a seat at the table, and sort of changing that in our courses and then going outside beyond that. So we see our work as really deeply invested in social justice and racial justice. And it's, I think, also woven into what we teach and why we teach it. Because you can't ask questions of, what is justice? What does it mean to live a good life if you're not grappling with the racial history of our country? And so I think all of our courses are looking at that in different ways and weaving that into the curriculum, teaching not just the Declaration of Independence, but slave narratives alongside it so that we complicate that history. Teaching the narrative of Frederick Douglass, teaching Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Those are always part of our curriculums. And some courses, I think, have really looked at how to move even beyond that. Harlem just did a unit this year in African history. Chicago has a summer course that uses the South Side of Chicago and the sort of Black history of that place as the text. So they look at the art and the literature and the history and migration in and migration out as sort of the way of exploring ideas and exploring the humanities. So I think it's always been central to us. I'll also say that we've been in a long conversation that I think we recognize that we still have work to do. That conversation is not over. We are always looking at how we match the sort of classical humanities with texts that have real direct and cultural relevance for our students today, how we think about the diversity or lack of diversity in our faculty and in our leadership and in our courses. Those are all things that we've been in conversation about and will continue to be in conversation about. And I feel also really confident that as our courses look to beginning again in the fall, this particular element of our moment is going to, I think, really inform that we're going to think about how to be deliberately anti-racist, not sort of explicitly anti-racist versus implicitly anti-racist, which I think, is sort of in that conversation anyway. So yeah, I think it's a really important moment. I think it gives us an opportunity to sort of take the conversation we've been having and keep moving it forward.
Thank you. Katie?
Well, I absolutely, agree and echo that, if you asked me a month ago, the role of diversity and race within the context of the NN Cannery History Project, I'd say, well, of course, yes, it goes without saying. But, what I've heard over the course of the past few weeks is you really have to say it. And through much of the 20th century, the canned salmon industry, and this cannery particularly, was a place where people came together for this common work that connected us, but they were also sites of segregation and discrimination and exploitation and sexism. For example, just this cannery, mess hall and bunkhouses were segregated by race for much of the 20th century. Racist place names litter the region. Canners referred to Scandinavian fishermen as the white fishermen, while the Italian, the Greeks, and the Croatian fishermen were called dagos. They were paid less. Doctors who treated the victims of the 1919 flu pandemic reasoned that the native children survived because they must have had at least one drop of white blood. There's literally a machine in canneries that are even used today called an iron chink. The passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 caused the stoppage of Chinese workers into the canning industry. And as a result, Mexicans filled that void until World War II. Mexicans have been completely erased from not just the story of canneries, but from Alaska history. So when women entered the workforce, they were sexually discriminated against and even abused. So if you had asked me again a month ago about African Americans and their contribution to the fishery, I would have told you that it was fairly minor. But again, the current moment has really inspired me to rethink that role. And I was looking through photographs, and there was a photograph from 1960 from the Diamond J cannery at Conneaug. And it's a photo of faces. All of these different faces is clearly this diverse group of people. And right smack in the center is an unnamed African-American worker. So yes, they were part of this story. And in fact, the moment has caused me to even look even further and investigate the story of African Americans in the fishery. And really the impact is in terms of the market. The American South bought huge quantities of Alaska canned salmon over the last century. And there's a report in 1900 from Jefferson Moser, who was a federal investigator of the Alaska canneries. And he wrote a passage about how, in fact, the NN Cannery, their market was Europe. It was the prime brand, but there were do-overs. In other words, the industry, the technology wasn't up to par, and so many cans were recanned, and that caused the fish to get mushy. And what Moser reports is that these cans were separated and were sold as chicken food as well as to Negro markets. So likewise, the industry sold a lot of canned salmon to white Southerners, and those cans were labeled with depictions of racist imagery hearkening back to slavery. So yeah, see, this is a story that I may not have paid attention to before, and now I am. And I just also want to say as well, from a personal perspective, I worked my way through school sliming fish at this cannery. I have a PhD because I worked side by side with the Filipino workers. I packed egg roe with the Japanese crew, and I was privileged because of my race. Absolutely. But at the same time, it was a privilege to work in that cannery space. It defined who I am. It impacted how I teach American history and Alaska history today. So yes, I was privileged, and I'm also, it was a privilege and an honor to have that experience.
I'm on mute. Thank you, both of you. And we're opening up to questions from the audience. And the first question we've already had come in, and this is for you, Vivé. How does one apply to start or create a Clemente course in one's community?
Yeah. So our organization, one of our primary roles, I guess, is to help make that happen. Our executive director, Leila Hilton, works really closely with communities that want to start Clemente courses. So the first thing I think is reaching out to our organization. But what I'll say is that Clemente is a very grassroots organization. We don't go to communities and say, you need a Clemente course, let's start one here. We work with communities who want a Clemente course, who see that need and that value in their community and come to us. And so starting a Clemente course is a process that includes bringing together a coalition of organizations in a community that want to do that. It always has a host organization, so a community-based organization that can seat the course itself in the community, among the individuals that they work with. These might be nonprofits. These they range from like affordable housing organizations to organizations that work with single mothers, this kind of thing. There's usually a host organization, a local higher ed partnership where faculty can be found and where sort of advising and support for students can be found. State humanities councils are critical for many of our programs. Not all of them sort of are in partnership with state humanities councils, but a lot of them are. So thinking about building a coalition of support around that brings together the different aspects, the academic aspect, the social aspect, the sort of community rooted aspect of it. But beyond that, our models are flexible. People have built these in different ways that reflect the needs of their communities. And then we provide a strong national network and bring together programs across the country to share resources and ideas and curriculum and support each other. The other thing I'll say is that one thing we're starting to talk about is how this move to virtual learning, we don't know how long this is going to go on, may make things look different for us. It may mean that a faculty member in a city that doesn't have a Clemente course can be teaching a Clemente course. It may mean that we're building programming that brings students from around the country into a virtual space together. We're exploring possibilities in that. But if somebody's interested in starting a course, I think the thing is to start looking at what are the organizations and individuals who are invested in this kind of work in the community, and how do you bring them together? And then we can work with the organization to start talking about the pieces to build and sustain a program from there.
Wonderful. And for Katie, does your organization have a position on Pebble Mine?
Ooh, Pebble Mine, yeah. Well, that's a very good question. Pebble Mine is an extraordinary threat to the Bristol Bay fishery. So I try very hard to, with my project, to maintain a stance that is inclusive and perhaps even apolitical, but you can't deny that Pebble Mine, if it goes through, will be an enormous threat, and that half of the world's red salmon return to Bristol Bay, and that watershed isn't just a gift to Alaska, it's a world treasure, and it's really up to us to decide how much is that mine worth it. And so yeah, it's a big threat.
And a question accompanying it, would the designation of your site impact the potentiality of the mine?
No. So it's important to also realize that this cannery was an economic engine of this particular region, and when it closed, it was devastating to the community in terms of work and labor. And I can understand why people are supporting Pebble Mine, because it represents jobs, and people need jobs right now. So it's really not about, am I for it, am I against it? What I'm for is for people to be able to make a livelihood and not have to leave their homes to do it. And so if we can create an opportunity through history and recognizing the history of these places, these canneries that are 100 years old and that are, they're outliving their use, if we can repurpose, those canneries in terms of things like heritage tourism, then diversifying the economy and supplying that kind of workforce, then that's what I would be for.
And for both of you, can you tell us how the economic impact of COVID-19 has played out for your projects? We'll start with Katie this time and then get to you.
Oh, okay. Well, for me, because we are just so grassroots, it's economically, our donations have pretty much dried up, our individual donations. That said, it's also put a great deal of emphasis and urgency for our project as well. So, really it is just highlighted the importance of history and the value that history can both serve to heal.
I think for us, the impact on the sort of administrative level of our programs remains to be seen. All of our programs are operating in partnership with higher ed and community programming, and a lot of that's going to filter down, and we're going to find out what that impact is. I think the impact we've been thinking a lot about economically is what it takes to run a program in a virtual space, and what again, coming back to this question of technology needs, and we can't do our programming if we can't raise the money or find a way to get technology in the hands of students who don't have it already. So Mass Humanities did a really beautiful job of that. They did a big fundraiser to buy Chromebooks for Clemente students. It was very successful, and we're thinking a lot about that. I just think that the financial needs, the economic needs of our students is going to change. What we need to do to run a course is going to include accessing and paying for and distributing technology, and then we suspect that the impact on our students is going to be strong, and the kinds of emergency funding and things like that we need to help people sort of stay afloat and have what they need to then be in our classroom is probably going to be higher than it has been in the past.
Mm-hmm. And then another question about the Clemente course. Is there, and this is a two-part question, so is there a way to access example curricula for Clementi? And are there themes that Clementi is particularly interested in focusing on in the coming years?
So we do have curricula from programs. I don't know that we have all of that sort of online and easy access. It's a good question and a good thing for us to be thinking about. I know that some programs have that on their websites. The program in Austin, which is called Free Minds, puts all of their syllabi online so that people can access them and look at them. But I don't know that we just have a place that you can go and look at curricula. We could certainly make that available. You know, programs will often choose a theme as a program and sort of build the curriculum around that theme. A theme that came up in our sort of national meeting that we had that we've been looking at and thinking about is the question of inflection points, right? Like COVID-19, this moment is very much an inflection point. And what do the humanities have to say about inflection points? What are texts that sort of manage and look into inflection points? And can we use our courses as a way to think about what happens when, you know, when crisis happens and the world changes? So that's floating right now. It came up in discussion, and we've been meeting across the network really quite often this summer to talk about how we move forward, and these curricular themes are one of those questions, because it feels like there's an opportunity to help people again make sense of and think through this moment that we're all living through, and to be deliberate about how our texts and the ideas that we explore help us do that.
Thank you. And then I think one last question for Katie. Can you tell us more about the public-private partnership that supports the NN Cannery History Project?
Well, sure. As you guys probably know, Alaska is really big. It's a big, big space. And Alaska lands are, much of that are public lands managed by both the federal and state governments, but there's quite a bit of history that exists on private holdings. And you know, think of our mining camps, aviation properties, lumber mills, fish camps, subsistence sites. These, so, you know, are privately held. And the NN Cannery is a perfect example of a privately owned property that holds unprecedented history. And so we have had to work very closely with the Trident Seafoods Corporation to educate them as to things like the National Register nomination and what that means to get the cannery listed, and also really to support the idea of history, and that, you know, this cannery, these industrial spaces have value beyond just economic, and that we can really begin to think about, again, how these old canneries, these old huge historic properties can be repurposed and revitalized, you know, possibly through heritage tourism and these type of programs. So in other words, thinking about envisioning the NN Cannery History Project beyond the exhibit and beyond kind of the moment, and think about how we can make history sustainable, and how we can you know, continue to do exactly what we got the NEH grant for, and that's to create a humanities community around, you know, the end of a 100-year-old cannery. As, you know, T.S. Eliot once observed, the end is where we start from.
That's a wonderful place to end. Thanks to all of you for calling in, and thanks to Vivé and Katie for joining us today. We'll be sending a link to a recording of this call in our next memo to members and to interested congressional staff. Please feel free to email us if you have ideas for future programs, and thank you again.